Welcome to the 103rd episode of the Hail Married podcast. I'm A. Toves, and I'm joined by my husband, the Toves. We're back with an update on UTSA basketball. Let's get started. It's kind of crazy to think the season is rapidly winding down, and before we know it, the conference tournament will be here.
Yeah, it's right around the corner. It's only, I think, 2-3 weeks away. So
The women are still undefeated at the Convo. We're now 22-3 overall, 13-1 in conference, and very close to securing the program record wins in a season. The current record was set back in the 2008-2009 season under Coach Ray Ripito-Blair at 24 wins. It would not be a stretch to say that this team could very easily break that program record.
yeah, and I mean they could honestly do it just during the regular season as opposed to like waiting until the tournament, right? So it's good for them. I mean, I think they've been working really hard, like we talked about, over the last few seasons. A lot of growth that we've seen. So really cool to see them actually kind of fulfilling some of their goals. And
yeah, and it was kind of interesting. The team didn't realize that this was within their reach. They asked Coach Aston about it at the post-game press conference after the East Carolina game, and she said she had only recently learned it, and Jordan didn't know that. You could tell from her facial expressions. So it's kind of interesting. They didn't even have this goal really in their sights, but now it's definitely something that's attainable and will likely be shattered, frankly.
well, and the reality is, I don't know that you would really make that a goal. You just keep saying like we just want to continue trying to win and improve, or the other way around. But the way this team has just been playing, you said it over and over. There's just never a doubt with them. They just seems like they always just find the way to keep winning, and they have. And this is how you break records: is that you continue to hold yourself to a standard, and that's how you keep winning.
Yeah, and speaking of records, Coach Aston is now 60-60 as head coach at UTSA. So 60 wins for her and counting.
Awesome.
The other great news from this week is that we have secured a double bye in the conference tournament. So we'll start in the quarterfinal on Monday, March 10th in Fort Worth.
It's great that we don't have to go to Denton for that, because it just would have felt like such a letdown to have to go into
the first round,
stupid North Texas, and have to go in there and go into their gym and have to play a few games. But that would have also meant that it wasn't a great season, because it's really for the lowest seeds. So good to hear that we played ourselves well out of it, and we pretty much, I think, had or knew that was going to be the case. But now it's just kind of jockeying for position. I think that they're pretty much also set to getting close to clinching at least one or two.
Yeah.
I'd have to check out the standings again, but it's going to be very hard to catch the Roadrunners the rest of the season.
Yeah, so let's talk about how we got here. We had 2 wins since our last podcast. The first was East Carolina at home. We won that game 60-46. Talk about an absolutely physical game.
Yeah, ECU came out and they started out tough, right? They had kind of taken a lead, but then it felt like they started kind of flexing their muscle a little, right? And, it just feels like more and more of these teams in the AAC are trying to be physical with UTSA, almost kind of towing the line at times. Mm-hmm. And I brought it up to you before, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, as we saw in seasons prior, there were things that you had seen from UTSA that you think now have kind of reversed.
Yeah, I mean, we've always tried to be a physical team, and defense has always been the focus. That's one of Coach Aston's premises, right? She always wants to have a good defensive-minded team. But at times in past seasons, I think because we weren't really mature enough in our playing style, we would get frustrated at times when we were in a close game, or when things weren't going our way, or shots weren't landing, and you saw us get into foul trouble. And it was almost like we would just get frustrated, and then you knew the fouls were coming, and they kind of start hacking girls, right?
Right.
And I think now it's sort of interesting because you're kind of seeing that approach being taken against UTSA. And even though we do have foul trouble, throughout the season, you see more of those fouls kind of being, I don't know, a little ticky tacky or, just a lapse versus where you just kind of knew in prior seasons, like, all right, we're getting frustrated, we're going to start fouling.
Yeah, there's going to be a spiral is
right.
the best way. I think you had said it before, but yeah, you can see the maturity in this UTSA team. Again, it started with those 4 or 5 freshmen, a few seasons ago, and the addition of Jordan Jenkins and how this program just kind of grew. And so you knew that at some point, or at least you hoped at some point, the maturity would finally kick in
right.
terms of how to handle a game. And it feels like with the addition of Nina and just, again, the growth, we're there. And
right.
it feels like it's gotten here much quicker than it actually it's been a few seasons, right? I mean,
right.
we're in the 4th season of Karen Aston. So let's talk a little bit about how physical this game got, though, because we did have Maya Linton ejected in the 3rd quarter after receiving 2 technical fouls, 1 in the first half and 1 in the second half.
Yeah, and I think, certainly that felt like a first for us being fans. I can't remember a game where we saw a women's player get ejected, but even Coach Aston said, in the post game that might have been a first for her, having somebody, ejected from a game. But
right.
The first technical foul was very similar to what we saw with Primo Spears in the Wichita State game. It was one of those fouls where, Maya and ECU's top player, Amaya Joyner, kind of got wrapped up, and you see, Joyner kind of fall on the ground, and then she gets frustrated and she throws the ball back at Maya, and Maya obviously is like, why are you throwing the ball at me? And she kind of in frustration just throws it back at Joyner. And so then that's when the foul gets called. And post game, Coach Aston said she didn't even really see the incident because she was just thinking it was a jump ball, and she was trying to figure out who had possession, and there wasn't really that much time left in the second half at that point, or the second quarter at that point. So she was trying to figure out, what's the next step, right? Do we have the ball? Do they have the ball? I honestly thought that they were going to call a foul on Sydney Love because real time, I didn't exactly see what had happened with the ball being thrown between Joyner and Linton. I just saw Sydney kind of what it looked like she was like standing over Joyner. I think in hindsight, what happened is that she was kind of, Joyner sort of fell in front of her and she was trying to stop her momentum, but it almost looked like she was taunting her, like just the way that her body kind of fell. Like it looked like she was kind of standing over her, and I was like, okay, they're going to call her for taunting. And then I heard, that there was a technical foul for taunting, but it was really on Maya.
I would have liked that that it would have been taunting on Sid because she's probably the quietest player and most stoic. But no, I saw that it was Maya because to me it looked like the way that she kind of reacted, and then all of a sudden the UTSA players pulled her away. Mm-hmm. When the ball got thrown back at Maya and Maya throws it back, it was more like a "how dare you speak to me" moment for Maya because I don't know what I know that Amaya Joyner was frustrated, like you said. It's not UTSA's fault that ECU was shooting horribly. In that second quarter, they shoot 6%.
Right.
You heard me, 6%. They hit one shot that entire second quarter. So going into halftime, their star player hasn't really gotten the touches. UTSA has done a great job of limiting, her looks. She still put up double figures within the first half, but I mean, it wasn't easy for her. She wasn't getting those looks that I think she's gotten in previous games, and that's what you get when you play a tougher team. And it was I think startling because again, like you said, it's not something you expect from a women's game. But then it just felt like it felt like Maya was controlled. But again, when I said "how dare you speak to me," it was very much what the hell are you doing? Like there was no rhyme or reason for it aside from the frustration. But then we get into halftime, it does feel like now things are a little odd. And then you come out in the third quarter, but you still kind of, there was a palpable tension, wouldn't you say? Like,
yeah, definitely. I mean, you could definitely tell that this game was chippy. And again, part of that, I felt like, as much as UTSA was saying, look, we were trying not to think about what happened the last time we played ECU. I don't know how you forget that
right.
ECU is the reason that you didn't advance in the tournament. So I think, as much as they said they wanted to leave that in the past, you know that that was on their mind. And ECU wanted to prove that they could beat them again. You know, they played spoiler
Right.
before.
It felt very 2022 North Texas and UTSA football when, you know, Frank Harris, and, you know, we've talked about so many times where he comes out and he's like, no, we weren't worried about, like, you know, the whole rivalry aspect for it. And he's doing the Flappy Bird afterwards, right? Like,
Right.
you knew that there was still something that you held against that team. And yeah, you could feel it. And then essentially you have one of their guards essentially throw an elbow high to Maya again, this time more in the open court. And look, we talked about how physical it was, and we have to remember the men's game is a vertical game, the women's game is a horizontal. So you're going to get more physicality from the women's game. But the way that ECU player flung her elbow up, I knew that it had to be like, if it wasn't going to be an intentional foul, there's going to have to be something, because there was just no way that it was a natural basketball move. Okay. And I get that Maya was on her, but again, this is how UTSA has matured in their defense. And
Right.
you talked about it earlier when you're like, you know, before there would be like these silly fouls. Maya would have probably been off that offensive player probably a couple feet, if not more, in previous seasons. But now, as she's gained confidence, as she's kind of upped her defensive game, she's right up on these offensive players. So you're not going to give them room. And that ECU player, you know, again, I think she had a tough shooting night too. So, I mean, it's one of those situations where there's a lot of frustration on the ECU side. Their coach, Kim Perkins, just yelling at her team at times because of the fact that they just weren't executing the plays that she had called. So there was a lot of stuff going on. I think ECU was kind of upset with their coach too. It's just, they had to get it out on someone. Apparently they decided that Maya Linton was that target.
Right. And then, you know, of course, Maya retaliates by yelling back at the girl, and then gets called for taunting and gets a technical foul. And so, because she'd had a technical foul earlier in the game, that meant she got ejected. The other girl got ejected as well because she had the intentional foul and a technical foul.
Yeah, and look, it just kind of bogged down the game a little bit. But then, you know, you made or we heard Coach Aston say post game that she felt like the ejection hurt the flow of the game, and the team didn't know how to be physical after that. And there's a lot of truth to it. I mean, you know, we talked about how ECU shot 6% in the second quarter, and then but like at halftime they were at 17%. It was just a bad shooting performance,
Right?
And it didn't get that much better in the third and fourth quarter for them, but it was at least about as good as they had done in the first quarter,
Right?
So
they were able to start shooting back in the 30%.
And look, you look back at UTSA, and UTSA at halftime was shooting 40%. So 40% to 17%. Yeah, the gap was 29-17 at halftime. I mean, that's going to happen. Like, if you're not going to shoot well and you dig yourself in a hole, these are the issues that you're now going to face, especially if you're on the road. Hold on to that thought right now, because we'll reference it back later when we talk about the men. The thing for me here is that they found a way to keep their cool, and I get that they weren't as physical, like Coach Aston said, but you also have to recognize that they still played good enough defense to put the game away. And, you know, we can quibble over, you know, whether, you know, there should have been more fouls called, what, you know, the physicality aspect, whatever. I think ultimately you look at it and say successful. You had Jordan scoring 23 points. Sydney Love had just a exquisite game from mid-range. She just kept pulling the trigger on her mid-range shot, and she just kept scorching East Carolina. And I wish that she would do that more, because I think that that game is her bread and butter.
Right.
And when she gets that shot, this UTSA team becomes incredibly difficult to defend. And especially because Sydney's normally playing off the ball. It's Nina's is the one that's a point guard. So having Sydney as sort of that combo guard and getting that, getting those looks is important. Again, Nina, it was weird. She just didn't have a very good night shooting wise. He was 0 for 5 and 0 for 3 from 3-point land. It was a weird night, but again, you have other teammates kind of step up, so it didn't really cause concern. Now, from the ECU perspective, you had Amaya Joyner, who you talked about. I mean, she really looked frustrated by the second half.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't against UTSA at any point after being frustrated with Maya Linton at the end of the first half, but I mean, when you have a player like Jade Tillman on ECU shooting 3 for 11 from the field, I was sitting next to Tamika Roberts-Nunez, who's a UTSA Hall of Famer for the track team and
women's basketball.
Yeah, and women's basketball. And she was just losing her mind every single time Jade shot the ball. But I was like, look, I mean, if she wants to shoot the ball and throw up that many bricks, we're good with it because they're following the defensive game plan, right? But it was at times just hilarious for us as UTSA fans, but I'm sure tough for ECU because she just really shot him out of the game, and it was a rough game. But I mean, we could have taken those bricks and maybe built a new Convo Center with that. But I digress. I will say, key takeaway here is that ECU grabbed 22 offensive rebounds. Now, look, they shot so badly, of course there's going to be that many rebounds, right? But UTSA did grab 27 defensive rebounds, but ECU grabbing 22 is a concern.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit more with Memphis too, but Coach Aston has pointed to rebounding as an area that we still need to improve on as we get into the tournament. Going into the Memphis game, we won 80-61. It's interesting when you look at that score, you would think that this was a dominant game throughout all 4 quarters, but it didn't exactly start off that way. So we'll kind of talk about this being a tale of 2 halves, but I think the thing that really helped, particularly in the second half, was just the amazing environment that we had in the Convo. It was the largest crowd of the season, over 1,500 fans, and they were loud, and I really do think that helped the team just stay focused and wear down Memphis in the second half.
Yeah, it looked like Memphis was having some problems communicating their plays at times, at least from my perspective when I was watching the game. And, you think back again, you think back to the Dome when Coach Traylor talks about, when we pack the Dome, it gets loud and our opponents have problems. Memphis had problems in that second half. I mean, it did get loud. And look, Memphis shoots well in the first and second quarter. First half, they're playing well, and they're up 40-38 at halftime. Like you said, the tale of 2 halves. In the second half, 21%.
Yeah. I mean, at one point during the first half, I think in the second quarter, Memphis had a 12-point lead.
Yeah.
And we just went on a run right before halftime. We tied it up, and they ended up making a shot right at the end or free throws, and took a slight lead into halftime. But, we had just erased a 12-point deficit at that point.
And it took some effort. I mean, that was, I think, one of the things to note here. But you look at the overall story and you start looking at Memphis just struggling in that second half to find answers. Like they just could not find a good shot. And you got to give it again to this UTSA defense. The players talk about the fact that they're defensive minded, they're a defensive team, right? And we've talked about how, previously about, Jordan having this big game, against ECU, and then Sydney having this, doing well in terms of her mid-range game. Those were non-existent. So how do we get this huge game here, Atos?
Yeah, I mean, Jordan was in foul trouble most of the game. She really didn't play that many minutes. She ended up coming back in and playing, but she had 4 fouls. And, you look at Sydney, she had a good game, but it certainly wasn't the game that she had
the
against
efficient game. Yeah.
against ECU. So, instead we talked about Nina and ECU struggling. Well, Nina kind of got her groove back in this game. I mean, she started out really well in the beginning. She had kind of a dry patch there in the middle in terms of her scoring offensively, but she ends up being the high scorer with 16 points. And then, to me, I felt like this was the breakout game for Asia Proctor.
Absolutely.
We've talked about Asia, on the podcast this season, and, wanting her to get her confidence back, because we saw moments her freshman year where you just really felt like she could be a rock star.
Yeah.
But, it just seemed like she was struggling with her confidence. And after the game, when she was being interviewed by the ESPN commentators, she said that she was struggling, or she has been struggling with her confidence shooting. But this game, she scores 15 points. She has 3 defensive rebounds. She has 3 assists. I mean, you called her a pest on defense, but, she really just seemed to gain confidence in shooting. There were still a couple of times where I saw her, drive down to the basket one-on-one and then pass the ball off. And I was like, Asia, you got to shoot. But she took more of those shots than we've seen her take in the last couple of games. And they were good. She's a really good shooter. She just has to get out of her head at times, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I think, especially defensively, and Coach Aston really talked about that post game as well, is the fact that, with Asia, one thing, she is a smaller player, a little more diminutive. But the fact that she's put up her arms and, really kind of deflected some passes, she looked like she was kind of bugging the Memphis players, especially in the passing lanes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just small things like that aren't ever going to show up on the stats. However, that it's bugged a team because they start getting into some sort of other problems. And Memphis, like I said, just couldn't find the rhythm that they had in that first half. If we had said, hey, halftime's only going to be a minute, and we just switch sides and we just keep going, I think Memphis continues on their roll. That's not how basketball games are played.
Right.
There's a gap there for halftime, and it just wasn't the same Memphis team that came back out there. Now, once again, there was still a little bit of physicalness there. There was an intentional foul called. This time it involved Adara Udo. So, it's interesting how things are happening, but again,
it's kind of also a little ironic given the fact that the intentional foul on Adara in Memphis is really what changed the trajectory of that game and how we won. So,
right.
It just kind of was ironic that it involved Adara in this game again.
It's yeah. I think the biggest thing with the Adara is that she just continues to provide that interior presence, and it was vacated by Alyssa Coleman's retirement. You would have had 2 big time, interior presences, I guess you can say, had Alyssa been able to continue playing. And it was a shame because Alyssa was playing some of her best ball at the end of what now is her career, right? But Adara has come in and really just done exactly what Alyssa was doing. She's, been a good shot blocker. She's been a good rebounder. She just seems to have a knack for being in that right place. Her offensive game can use a little bit more touch up, but I think, her continuing to, just work on that, she'll be fine. But let's talk real quick about Taylor Ross, a freshman. I knew she was good. I think that she adds to just that sort of enforcer mentality that Adara has, where they're both just physical, low post players. And Taylor's going to learn as she continues to mature. But, man, there are some times she just also has this knack for putting her hand up at the right time, and she just blocks shots. And I believe that Adara is taller than Taylor, but man, Taylor is just, I don't know. She just has this way of fighting the ball, much like Adara does. And you just can't teach that. They're just natural instincts that she has. So, interior wise, we're set in the future, I think, in my opinion. I think we've got some good players. But to finish off with Asia, you're right. Like there's, add Asia to the equation there, and you kind of see just how this team has been made up. And they came out and they really played for each other at times, and right when they really needed each other, like you said, Jordan went out and they needed somebody to step up, and people have.
And Coach Aston talked about that post game where, she said going into the tournament, one of the things that you can't prepare for is what's going to happen if somebody gets into foul trouble. And last year, Jordan getting into foul trouble would have had a much bigger impact on this team, or Adara fouling out like she did in the ECU game would have had a bigger impact on the team. But now you see the bench step up. And we've talked about, the contributions from Cheyenne throughout the season. But now you see, really great games from Taylor Ross. You're seeing Asia becoming more confident when she comes in off the bench. And those are the things, those true contributions are the things that Coach Aston, I think, feels much more confident about now heading into the tournament, because she knows that she can rely on that bench. She knows that they're not just going to come in and kind of sustain, they're going to come in and contribute.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the one player that I was going to mention that we hadn't really mentioned was Demara Allen, another freshman. She comes in usually early into games, and if she's not starting, and she provides a defensive presence. That's one of those things that, like, as a freshman, like, you don't expect a freshman to have such good defensive instincts, but she does. Again, I think she just needs to work a little bit on her offensive game, but again, we have some really good players, young players, and it really helps the fact that I think that they've been at least growing right in front of us with the help of these veteran UTSA players. So, look, after these two games, you mentioned our record. Latest bracketology keeps UTSA as a 13 seed, but this time in Oxford, Mississippi, versus Ole Miss, which would be the 4 seed. Why do I bring this up? Because at Ole Miss is former Coach Aston assistant Empress Davenport, who was on UTSA's bench last year. Now she's up at Ole Miss. So it would be interesting to see, if all this plays out and this is how, UTSA wins the tournament, they get into the NCAA tournament, and they had to play at Oxford, Mississippi, which is probably a better bet than going to Raleigh, much more regional, kind of easier for UTSA to get to, especially some fans potentially. It'd be cool to head off against Empress.
Yeah, I think it's always fun to see, a former assistant go up against their head coach. Now, I get it. She's still an assistant. It's not like she's in that head coach role, but I think it's still, interesting to see how does a former assistant game plan against UTSA.
Yeah.
The next two games for UTSA women are on the road. Rice this Saturday, 4 p.m., also on ESPN+, followed by Tulane on Tuesday, February 25th at 6:30 on ESPN+. All right, let's move on to the men's team. Toves, I think I might have jinxed the guys when I said they just needed one more win to match last season, because they've been on a 4-game losing streak since I made that comment.
I don't I don't think you jinxed them. I think they just it's late in the season, and I think that unfortunately there's some things that have caused some problems for them.
Sure. Well, they are 10-15 overall, 4-9 in conference, and currently sitting in 11th place. Let's kind of dive into these last two games. Now, we didn't get to see all of these games just because of conflicts with the schedule, but we did watch portions of each of these games.
Yeah, well, namely the Wichita State game that we lost 69-64. The reason we didn't watch it was at the same time as the women's game, which we were at the women's game in the Convo. In this game, we have 4 guys in double figures: Raekwon 16, Smurf 13, Primo 12, Damari 11. Atos, for such a good shooting free throw team, they only hit 50% of their free throws in this game. And I know that doesn't sound like a lot, especially when you go 4 for 8 overall in the game.
Right.
But what I want you to concentrate here is 8. 8 free throw attempts. This is one of the issues that I was talking about as to why they're sitting in 11th place. Mm-hmm. they're not taking it to the basket. They're not drawing those fouls. You got to be able to do that. And it's really the opposite of what you've seen with the women. They had an 8-point lead at one point. They just can't sustain it. It just goes back to this thing of where they can build leads at times, but they just can't sustain them throughout a game. And they have trouble just continuing to build on or use their defense to, help them get through some maybe tough offensive stretches. And a lot of it also goes with rebounding. That this team struggles with rebounding.
Yeah. And going back to the free throws, we have one of the best free throw shooting percentage teams in the country, not just in the conference, in the country. I think we have 4 players who can shoot free throws at over 80%, which is just ridiculously high. So not creating those opportunities hurts us, and then not executing on them, which is really surprising when you think about our typical percentage, because when you get free throws, they're typically at critical points in the game. And when you miss them, unfortunately, that just, tends to amplify or create an issue where you then can't overcome that loss.
And I wouldn't say this is necessarily where it happened, but we just got chipped away. A lot of it, overall shot 40.9%, but 25% from 3-point range. And you see that a lot with the men, where I think the bigger problem is not just UTSA men's basketball, but just men's college basketball just in general, is that you get caught up in, well, we should just shoot the 3-pointer and forget the rest of the floor. And you don't see good teams doing that. You see the good teams vary where they shoot from, and it's not just solely a 3-point game. But at this point, unfortunately, that's what it feels like. At times that this UTSA team just relies on. It's just, and maybe it's just a lot of it conditioning too. I mean, we've talked a lot about the challenges with the depth and just where we're at. So yeah, at some point those legs kind of, especially late in season, start kind of giving out, and you see 25% from 3-point range, and it starts factoring in there. You're on the road. It's not an easy. It sounds easy to just hop on a plane and go somewhere, but I think everybody knows, sometimes you hop in there and you don't get off as fresh from a plane as you can.
Well, and given the fact that we had beat Wichita State by such a large margin the first time we played them, they were definitely looking to win this game. And, they only won it by 5 points, credit to UTSA, but again, this was a game that Wichita State, you knew was going to give you their best shot, because they wanted to erase the memory of what happened in the combo. Right.
Return the favor, so to speak. And then we get to Tulsa, where we lose 80-76. This one, remember I said in the women's, hey, if you dig yourself a hole in the first half, or dig yourself a hole just shooting wise, it's the killer. That's what happened in this game, Toves.
Yeah. 3 guys again in double figures. Raycon has 20 points. Smurf has 19. Primo 18. But the first half shooting was really just what killed us. We shot 20% overall in the first half, and 20% from the 3-point. And that just killed us. I mean, the second half shooting was much better. 44% overall, 43.8% 3-point. But when you have that hole, how do you dig yourself out of it? And then Raekwon fouling out was just, kind of too much for us to overcome.
Yeah, and look, you talked about the shooting percentages in the second half, 44% and 43%, which would be good if you're finishing off the game. You'd be like, okay, we can deal with that. But if you're going to win the game, you're talking about how do you do it? Well, you got to shoot probably closer to 50% and hit more shots in order to erase that entire deficit. And unfortunately, this team just can't overcome those challenges. We've talked about, what some of those issues are. I think in watching some of that Tulsa game, I think what was frustrating is, I've heard stuff about like the women's game where it's like, well, they miss a lot of layups. There's a lot of missed layups in men's college basketball. We just kind of blow past it because, well, it's just the men playing, right? And we get to see a dunk or something. There's a lot of missed easy shots from the men too. So to me, it's just weird when people say that, but and that's the challenge with this is our shooting woes. It's like, how do we find those easier shots and actually make them? It's two things. But look, I think it's easy to be pessimistic as a UTSA fan and just say, look, just like the last few seasons, we continue to lose. And, I don't care about the deficit, even though it's 5 and 4 points here in these last 2 games, we're still losing, right? Atos, we previously discussed how, the lack of depth has really challenged this team. And look, there's a difference between playing with only 8 players while still having some depth versus the current state of UTSA, which is playing the entire depth of 8 players. And that's really what we're doing. There's rarely the 9th guy comes in, and that's Naz Muhammad. He's the other scholarship player, but he rarely plays. It just shows just where UTSA is, like, and the thin margin that they have to hold on to in every single game in order to really be competitive. And, it's funny. I asked Andy Everett after one of the basketball radio shows, I said, what do you think for the rest of the season with the men? Like, I'd been going back and forth on this, and he said, I could see us winning every single game because this team is talented enough to do so, or I could see us losing every single game. He's like, because of the depth and all of these issues. And look, the depth limits Coach Claunch's, ability to have different defensive looks. Like you can't really, he switches up the defense, but you can't really switch it up too much because you also risk, if you're too aggressive, foul trouble.
Right.
Kind of like we talked about with the women. And then we're playing 4 perimeter players essentially, and only 1 post. That's how we're usually playing every single game. So you never see Joe Smith or David Hermes are only 2 posts in the game at the same time. It's 4 perimeter players. And I don't really count Raekwon as a forward. I mean, he's sort of a wing player. I don't know. I wouldn't say that he's necessarily a forward, but he does
kind
get
of a
listed.
hybrid.
Yeah. But he's a wing, and it's kind of ambiguous now to just say a guard or a forward, right? So in reality, I mean, that's the problem. And that we talked about earlier, the problems with the rebounding. Well, you've only got 2 post players.
Right.
You've got Joe and David. And, I think David still needs another season to, I think, understand better rebounding positioning. Joe just gets squeezed out because there's usually 2 guys on him underneath the basket. So he has no shot. So that ends up being obviously problems, but as his depth gets challenged, you also see shot selection issues and offensive efficiency just like take hits. You're just not getting those easy baskets as we were talking about. The shot selection really devolves down at times to just, let's just jack up a 3-pointer and let's try to get back on defense. I think it's a different challenge than what Coach Henson had to deal with in the last few seasons. Like he limited his bench, and he still had some other players that he would bring on every now and then. But, I still think this team is much more talented than what we've seen lately in a while, honestly. And, look, Atos, I know it's going to be tough, but I think one of the biggest takeaways I have here is that, Coach Claunch missed on Jaquan Scott and Skylar Wicks, 2 scholarship players that are no longer with the team. And you could use those 2 players at this point because he could be able to do a little bit more with them. I'm not saying that really is the entire difference, but man, it's tough. And we kind of talked away from the pod about how difficult it is for a basketball team to miss on a player. If they miss on a player, and you can recover. You miss on 2 scholarship players, and boy, that's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the small roster size of the basketball team compared to football or some of the other teams, you don't have an opportunity to miss.
Yeah, and to me, like I said, the biggest thing is the fact that they're gone because of personal reasons. If they had just been injured, I would have been much more, I think, understanding of it and going, here's the injury bug, right? All right, so there's nothing you can do about it. We lost Mo Jai, in this season.
And Paul Lewis, yeah.
Yeah, and Paul Lewis. 2 other guys that, like, if we had them right now, maybe the season's totally different, right? And probably is different. So, it's just some tough moments. I think this team continues to give it all. And so as much as that poor shooting in the first half of the Tulsa game may have been tough, I'm still confident in Coach Clonch because of the fact that he's still able to get as much as possible out of this team and got them to rally. Like,
yeah,
they could have just called it in and said, nope, that's it. I'm not really trying the next half.
And I mean, really, the only game where you've seen just a big, significant point loss was at Tulane, that first game, where you just kind of felt like they sort of fell apart. But you've seen this team rally in all of these games, particularly the last handful of games have been, a point, 2 points, 5 points. They're just so close, and I'm sure it's frustrating, but it's a positive to be able to see that they keep coming back and, they keep putting in the effort and keep rallying. So, it certainly gives you hope for the future, particularly when you think about Smurf coming back next season, potentially, Mo getting the extra season of eligibility because of his injury, Paul Lewis coming back next season, Bob Jai coming back. Hopefully we have something to build on for the future.
And I think we do. I mean, I think Coach Clonch has shown how he can construct a roster, and that I think is key. Mm-hmm. Obviously this first season was always going to be let's just see what we have and see what we can do.
Right.
And it was the same thing with, Karen Aston when she first came on. The difference, though, I think between both those seasons is that Karen Aston's team was really devoid of a lot of talent. Coach Clonch has been able to keep this talented team together more. And so there's a confidence there. Let's just see how, he continues to build upon that. But, I do appreciate the contributions from Damari Monsanto, from Primo Spears, and Joe Smith. I've raved a lot about Joe Smith, but I mean, the thing is that just these guys, this is their only season at UTSA, but they just seem to, as we've been talking about over and over, just continue to rally and just play as hard as possible. They're not in a great situation, but they put us in a position to at least feel hopeful for the future.
Absolutely. And Bob Jai is playing as a walk-on. So, hopefully we'll see him be a scholarship player in the future.
I see a little Maya Linton in him where, he can, he's got a little bit of rough of offensive game, but, you continue working at that and, then, potentially maybe make him a defensive stalwart. The difference was Maya went from being a post player to being a wing player. So she had much more adjustment to make. So me saying that her offensive game is a little rough, it's tough because she had to adjust to playing offense differently than she had pretty much her entire career. I think with Bob, it's just getting used to the speed of, college basketball and then, being put in a position where I don't think he thought that he would be like, he'd be playing as much, that maybe he'd get those timely moments, but, he's been forced in the lineup, but I think he's persevered and he's shown, I think what both teams have shown, which is resilience. Now, the men's team hasn't been able to overcome some of these challenges and, win some of these games, but they've still been resilient even in the face of those challenges.
Absolutely. Well, next up for the men, they play South Florida at the Convo Wednesday at 7 p.m. If you can't make it out to the Convo, that's also on ESPN+. And then they travel to ECU on Sunday, February 23rd at 1 p.m. on ESPN+. Before we wrap up kind of the men's section, I think one thing to note is just something else that happened in conference play this weekend, and that was Wichita State, which we just talked about, playing UTSA, and the fact that that was only a 4-point win. They managed to beat number 14 Memphis, who was sitting atop the conference standings. So now North Texas is 1.5 games behind Memphis in second place. It's interesting because Memphis, being ranked 14th overall, they were picked as a number 5 seed in the most recent projected bracketology. It remains to be seen what losing to Wichita State is going to do for their NCAA hopes and what that could mean if they don't win the tournament. It sort of makes you feel like perhaps there is an upset coming in the men's conference tournament this year.
Yeah, for me, I've always thought that Memphis has been sort of overrated this entire season. They're a good team, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying they're overrated. They're not number 14. They're much lower than that. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. I think AAC basketball is down, but it's not bad basketball. It's not as strong as it has been in recent years. And I think anybody is still capable of winning that tournament. I'm not going to say that UTSA is going to, or even in the realm of possibility of doing that, but they could, to your point, spring maybe win a couple games here or there, mm-hmm. which would really, I think, set up Coach Clonch well for the future. But it's been a while since the men won a conference tournament game, so it'd be good to see if they could pull it off. They'd have to do it in Denton, but
But hey, they have a win in Denton this season.
They do. So there's that hope.
All right, before we go, let's talk a little bit about some news from UTSA football.
All right.
When we talked last on the pod, and we mentioned that Coach Traylor had said he was unsure whether Cyrus Dumas would be granted another year of eligibility. While we haven't heard anything official, Cyrus did post on Twitter that he was looking for a job. Kind of made it sound like his career was over and he was looking for maybe a coaching job. So I'm going to take from that it sounds like he didn't get granted his other season of eligibility. Again, nothing official, but just based on his own words, our assumption is that he was not included in that JUCO eligibility. So unfortunately, we'll be looking for another corner, it sounds like.
Yeah, and we'll have a couple spots, but I think it's going to be important to provide some depth there because that room got tested at the end of last season with some injuries.
Yeah. We also learned that running back Will Henderson is also running track this season for UTSA. He won second place in the 60-meter at his first collegiate meet, so congratulations to Will. He was a state champion in track in high school in Gilmer, as well as playing football. So it's great to see him have an opportunity to play both sports here at UTSA as well. And it's kind of unique. I mean, while it's not unheard of to have, two sport athletes in college, we really haven't had a track and a football athlete at the same time that I recall anyways, in our short football history.
Well, Atos, based on our UTSA football history, I would not imagine we'd have too many track stars. It was not really a team built on a lot of team speed earlier in the in its history. So,
sure.
Got to have someone that eventually breaks that mold. And last year we saw Will Henderson have some moments on the field, and you could see what that meant in terms of team speed. So, good to see him working on that. And we'll see how that kind of affects his football participation, but I would imagine that he was probably encouraged by Coach Traylor to go out there and, run some track. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about UTSA softball because this is another team that, has a newer coach and is, trying to reform themselves a little bit, kind of build back that program. And Coach Van Studeman has done a really nice job of, recruiting and trying to redo this UTSA team. This season, they're currently 7-3. They won the UTSA Invitational Tournament last weekend at UTSA, where they're also undefeated so far. So good to see the girls go out there and defend home field. Mm-hmm. They did go 2-3 this weekend at the Lion Classic Tournament, losing twice to Southeastern Louisiana University. It was a couple of tough losses, but I think as you're starting to see this team kind of grow, it's much like we've talked about so many times with, the women's basketball team, what we're seeing with the men's basketball team. You're starting to get young players in the program, and you're starting to see them shine. And I say that because right now, freshman Sabrina Wick is leading the team with a 382 batting average, and then she's followed by senior Jalen Pritchard, and then freshman Skylar Rucker. I know it's early in the season, Atos, but it's good to see that two of our three top hitters are freshmen.
Right.
Because it means that there's maybe more success in the near future. Hopefully. I know they're freshmen, but we've seen freshmen all throughout the nation, especially in many of these sports, really have success. And hopefully Sabrina and Skylar keep it up. And hopefully, the team continues to improve, because I would like to go out there and, watch some more softball games. As Atos would probably chime in at some point, I am, for some reason, a softball I won't say guru, but just
aficionado.
I don't know. Maybe I'm a big fan of it. I don't know what it is, but there's something about just seeing these women like just throw 70-mile-per-hour underhand pitches and do it with, I guess, the most ease I've ever seen in my life. Hopefully we see this team continue growing. Just real quick, senior Chrysalyn Moreno leads UTSA with 2 home runs and a triple. So we got some things going. And again, hopefully we see this team. I think they have a couple more tournaments out at UTSA here in the next couple weeks. So we'll see if they build on this progress.
Absolutely. Well, I think that about wraps it up for us at the Hail Mary podcast. Thanks for joining us. I'm Atos.
And I'm the Toves.
We'll be back soon with more basketball coverage.
Birds up.